Emma had always been an adventurous soul, the kind of person who thrived on the unexpected. She loved hitchhiking, believing it to be the ultimate expression of freedom and trust in humanity. But that all changed one cold, rainy night in October. She was traveling through the remote back roads of Oregon, where the dense forests swallowed the light and the mist clung to the ground like a ghostly blanket. After hours of fruitless thumbing, a pair of headlights finally pierced the gloom. A weathered old pickup truck slowed to a stop beside her. The driver was a grizzled man in his 60s, his face a maze of wrinkles and stubble. He introduced himself as Hank and offered her a ride to the next town. Desperate to get out of the rain, Emma accepted. As they drove, Hank's initial friendliness gave way to an unsettling silence. He seemed to study her from the corner of his eye, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. Emma tried to make small talk, but Hank's responses were curt, almost dismissive. The forest closed in around them, the trees forming dark, towering walls on either side of the narrow road. Emma's unease grew when Hank took a sudden turn onto an even narrower, unmarked road. The truck bumped along the rough path, deeper into the woods. "Shortcut," Hank muttered, more to himself than to her. The further they went, the more the forest seemed to press in on them, the branches clawing at the windows like skeletal fingers. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She discreetly checked her phone. No signal. Panic started to bubble up inside her. "Are you sure this is the right way?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Hank didn't answer. Instead, he slowed the truck to a crawl and then stopped completely. They were in a small clearing, surrounded by trees that blocked out the moonlight. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Hank turned to her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "End of the line," he said, his voice a low growl. Emma's mind raced. She knew she had to get out of the truck, fast. She fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Hank's gnarled hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. "You're not going anywhere," he snarled. Fear surged through Emma. She yanked her hand free and kicked at the door with all her might. It flew open, and she tumbled out into the mud. She scrambled to her feet and ran, branches tearing at her clothes and skin. Behind her, she heard Hank cursing and the sound of the truck door slamming. She didn't dare look back. She just kept running, deeper into the woods, until she could no longer hear his footsteps or the truck's engine. Hours later, exhausted and terrified, Emma stumbled upon a small hunting cabin. She pounded on the door, praying someone would answer. An elderly couple opened it, their eyes widening at the sight of her. They took her in, gave her a blanket and some hot tea. Through her tears, Emma told them what had happened. The couple exchanged grim looks. "You're lucky to be alive," the old man said. "People have gone missing on that road, never seen again." Emma shuddered, realizing how close she had come to becoming one of them. She never hitchhiked again, her adventurous spirit forever haunted by the memory of that cold, rainy night and the man with darkness in his eyes. Jake had always lived life on the edge. He loved the thrill of the unknown and the freedom that came with hitchhiking. One summer night, while traveling through the lonely back roads of West Virginia, he found himself stranded. The sun had set, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and the hum of cicadas. Jake stood by the side of the road, thumb out, hoping for a ride to the nearest town. Minutes stretched into hours, and just as he was about to give up, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. A sleek, black sedan slowed to a stop beside him. The driver, a middle-aged woman with strikingly pale skin and raven black hair, rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" she asked, her voice smooth and inviting. Jake hesitated for a moment, something about her unsettling him, but he pushed the feeling aside and climbed in. The car was immaculate, and the woman introduced herself as Evelyn. They set off, the car gliding smoothly down the dark, winding road. Evelyn asked Jake about his travels, and they made small talk. Her demeanor was calm, almost too calm, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As they drove deeper into the woods, the road became narrower and more desolate. Jake's unease grew when Evelyn took an unexpected turn onto an overgrown dirt path. "This doesn't look like the way to town," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. Evelyn's smile didn't reach her eyes. "It's a shortcut," she replied, her voice as smooth as ever. "Trust me." But trust was the last thing Jake felt. The deeper they went, the darker it became. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The only sound was the gravel crunching under the tires. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a clearing. In the center stood an old, decrepit house, its windows dark and empty. Evelyn stopped the car and turned off the engine. The silence was deafening. "Why are we stopping here?" Jake asked, his heart pounding in his chest. Evelyn turned to him, her expression cold and devoid of the friendliness she had shown earlier. "This is where the ride ends," she said, her voice now a chilling whisper. Jake's blood ran cold. He reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Evelyn's eyes seemed to glow in the darkness, and her smile twisted into something sinister. "You shouldn't have gotten in," she whispered, leaning closer. Panic surged through Jake. He slammed his shoulder into the door, finally forcing it open. He tumbled out of the car and ran into the forest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him, he heard Evelyn's laughter, a sound that echoed through the trees. Jake ran until his legs gave out. He collapsed onto the ground, chest heaving. As he lay there, he realized he had no idea where he was. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows, and every direction looked the same. In the distance, he heard the faint sound of a car engine starting. Fear gripped him as he realized Evelyn was still out there, searching for him. He scrambled to his feet and kept moving, praying he would find his way out before she found him. Hours later, as dawn began to break, Jake stumbled upon a rural highway. Exhausted and terrified, he flagged down a passing truck. The driver, a grizzled old man, took one look at Jake and nodded, understanding without words. As they drove away, Jake glanced back at the forest. The house and the clearing were nowhere to be seen. He knew he had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death, and the memory of that night would haunt him forever. Jake never hitchhiked again, his adventurous spirit forever shadowed by the encounter with Evelyn and the ride that nearly cost him his life. Sarah had always believed in the kindness of strangers. Hitchhiking was her way of experiencing humanity up close and personal. But that changed on a cold November night in rural Pennsylvania. The air was crisp and the moon hung low, casting long shadows on the empty road. She had been standing there for hours, her thumb out and her breath visible in the chill. Just as she began to lose hope, a beat-up station wagon rattled to a stop beside her. The driver, a man in his late 40s with unkempt hair and a gaunt face, rolled down the window. "Need a lift?" he asked, his voice gravelly and tired. Sarah hesitated for a moment, but the cold pushed her to accept. She climbed into the car, which smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. The man introduced himself as Tom and offered her a ride to the next town. As they drove, Tom asked her about her travels, his eyes darting between her and the road. Sarah noticed his hands were trembling, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel. Unease settled in her stomach, but she pushed it aside, attributing it to the late hour. The road wound through dense forests, the trees closing in like an endless tunnel. Suddenly, Tom made a sharp turn onto a narrow dirt path. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "This isn't the way to town," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Tom glanced at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Shortcut," he muttered, but there was an edge to his voice that sent a shiver down her spine. The path grew rougher, and the trees seemed to press closer. Sarah's unease turned to fear when she noticed the scars on Tom's wrists. Her mind raced with stories she had heard about hitchhikers who never made it to their destinations. The car came to a stop in front of an old abandoned cabin. Tom turned off the engine and turned to her, his eyes now filled with a strange, unsettling intensity. "End of the line," he said, his voice a whisper. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to run. She yanked the door handle, but it wouldn't open. Tom's hand clamped down on her wrist, his grip ironclad. "You shouldn't have gotten in," he whispered, a sinister smile creeping across his face. Panic surged through Sarah. She kicked at the door, finally breaking it open. She tumbled out into the night and ran, her heart pounding in her ears. She didn't look back, the sound of Tom's laughter echoing in her mind. Hours later, exhausted and terrified, she stumbled upon a farmhouse. The kind farmer took her in and called the police. When they arrived, Sarah led them back to the cabin, but it was empty. Tom was gone, leaving only shadows and fear in his wake. Sarah never hitchhiked again. The memory of that night and Tom's dark eyes haunted her forever. a stark reminder that not all who offer a ride are kind.